It's a hard line, but it's our own line, built with love and dedication, self-assured is our small nation, one man's dream, oh, independence. And God bless the Prince of the Hutt River Province. God bless the man whose dream has come true. God bless this land where dreams can come true. God bless the Prince of the Hutt River Province. God bless this man whose dream has come true. God bless this land where dreams can come true.
Good morning. Welcome back. Indeed, God bless this man, the founder of the Hutt River Province, and God bless this land where dreams can come true. Okay, so that was the national anthem for the Hutt River Province, one of the micronations that we read about for today. A couple of things to point out relating back to the lecture from last time in relation to that video. One, obviously, the national anthem is an artifact from Hutt River Province. It is it's part of a larger symbolic construction of a sense of identity, of nationality. Something that, as Benedict Anderson argues, our sense of nationality, our sense of national identity, is something that we create, we collectively imagine. So in that video, of course, we hear the anthem for the Hutt River Province. We see the flag, another artifact. We also see the portrait of the founder of the Hutt River Province with his sort of royal regalia on, staring off into the future, we assume. So not only do we have the flag, we also have our sovereign ruler. So all of these elements are part of a larger construction of an identity that goes along with the Hutt River Province. In each of the cases that we're going to be looking at today, be thinking about this. Be thinking about what does it mean to set up a state? Each of these examples we can think of as countercultural states. They are oppositional to the mainstream geopolitical order that is the United Nations and the dominant nation states that exist in our world. Each of these examples are of people who at one point resided within the jurisdiction of a nation state recognized by an international governing body and decided to form a new one, an oppositional state. In these cases, in each of these cases, these micronations, these alternate states, present challenges to both the nation state within which they reside. So it is a rebellion against, so for instance, the Hutt River Province we can see as a rebellion against the nation state of Australia. They are also a rebellion against the international order of statehood, the legal means to establish what is a state and what is not. So each of these examples rebel against not only the particular state, but against the state in general. When we look at each example, we'll be thinking about how that rebellion, how that resistance to this idea of statehood is different in each case. We will also be paying attention to and considering what we discussed last time in the previous lecture, which is that a state isn't just a geographical physical territory. A state is also the laws that govern it, and it is also, as we discussed last time, a symbolic construction of identity shared by all of the individual members, citizens of the state. So to construct a state, whether you are constructing South Sudan or you're constructing the Hutt River Province, the work goes beyond just saying, here are our borders, here is our territory. You need to symbolically construct a sense of identity, of shared identity with a common idea, which is the state, which is what does it mean to be from Hutt River? What does it mean to be from America? What does it mean to be from Sealand, et cetera, et cetera? So each of these examples are rebelling against the standard notions of the nation state. They are rebelling against the nation states from within which they emerge. They are, and that rebellion goes beyond just a territorial dispute. That rebellion is also against certain ideas of subjectivity or identity. So we need to keep this in mind when we look at these, because really, once we dig into the nationality side of things, the identity side of things, that's where we get to find some really interesting and important distinctions between these three examples of micronations. So we're going to look at these three examples: Sealand from England, Hutt River Province from Australia, and Chistiania from Denmark. On Friday, we'll be looking at virtual states that are we'll find a lot of overlap between these oppositional, rebellious, countercultural real states, but of course, with the virtual states, they don't have physical territory. But more on that on Friday. We're focused on real states. So I'm calling these real states because they have physical territory. Now, are they real? Like, what does it mean to be so they're real in the sense that they are physical, they're in physical reality. What does it mean to be a state? And in a lot of ways, we can use these as examples to learn a little bit more about international law, but we can also use these as ways to philosophically pose the question: how do we know what is a state and what is not a state? Why is that distinction important? And, of course, why would you even want to establish a state in the first place? Okay, so each of these examples, Sealand, Hutt River Province, and Chistiania, were established by different people at different times within within an already existing governing state. So their motivations are going to be counter to the state. So the motivations are always going to be setting up some sort of alternative way to do things. They're oppositional. They are, so we have to see these in many ways. If we think back to our discussion of Thomas More's Utopia, and one of the ways that we went about making sense of it was to understand what contemporary England for Thomas More looked like, so that we could see that his vision of utopia was constructed in relation to, it's almost like his utopia was the shadow of contemporary England. So in any of these examples, we are understanding utopias as responses to the present. They're imaginings of the future in response to the present. This is also happening in each of these cases of micronations. The people who establish these micronations are establishing them in response to political realities in the commonly recognized nation states within which they live, and they want to create alternatives to that. So, what are the alternatives that you can create? Here are just a couple. Economic alternatives. So each of these micronations are about creating a new type of economy, a new type of economic system. So what could that mean? It could mean avoiding taxes, right? So that's a part of the economic system. Think back to South Sudan. One of the first things they have to do is establish how to collect taxes from people in the marketplace. So each of these examples of micronations are setting up their micronation so that they don't have to pay taxes to England or Australia or whatever. But it's not just about being a sort of tax-free libertarian. It's also about creating new markets. So think back to your study of U.S. history in high school and think back to Teddy Roosevelt. One of the things that he's famous for in domestic policy is breaking up the railroad monopolies. The argument for breaking up railroad monopolies is the argument that follows any sort of response to monopolization of a market. As soon as a market is monopolized, it is no longer competitive. And as soon as it is no longer competitive, then it really just serves the interests of the people who own the monopolies at the expense of everyone else. So if you are somebody setting up a micronation who has a much more sort of libertarian mindset, you can set up a market that isn't controlled and monopolized by the larger governing structures of your home country. Okay, so and there are other examples of how you can set up an alternate economy through setting up a new state. Another thing, the second category is practice or lifestyle. And in each of these examples, central to it is being able to do something, do some sort of activity that is illegal otherwise. So you're living in... So we'll really discuss this at length with Chistiania, but you're living somewhere where you are not allowed to do a certain substance. The only reason you can't do that substance is because of the governing laws of that nation state. You decide, I don't want to obey those laws, and I don't want to be put to prison for not obeying those laws. In that moment of rebellion, of criminality, in that moment, you are also denying one of the most foundational, important, symbolic elements of national identity, right? So if you are saying, no, these laws do not apply to me, we can think of this to translate to, I am not of this nation state. These laws do not apply to me. I am not a part of this nation. I am a part of this other nation. So when we're looking at practice, we can really see how national identity plays into this, and we can see this at a very direct example when we're looking at the legalization of drugs. So if you say, I do not recognize these laws about controlled substances, you are also saying, I do not recognize this as a foundational part, this nationality as a foundational part of my identity. The third thing is the speculative. Now, this is where the utopian aspect comes in, and this is something that, and I'm going to sort of fill this out using the Benedict Anderson ideas, or the Benedict Anderson framework, so that we can think a little bit more nuanced about utopian thinking in reality as a real life practice, not just as a sort of science fiction that we read. So in each of these examples, people are setting up real states. They are living this lifestyle out. They are actually participating in these alternate economies. So at the same time that they are constructing these states, they are constructing these new laws, they are constructing these new infrastructures, they are also constructing these new conceptions of identity. They are constructing new understandings of nationality. They are constructing new senses of subjectivity. So if we're going to think about this as a cause and effect relation, things get a little confusing. So if the way that things are set up, the governing, the laws, all the practical and pragmatic things about laws, taxation, infrastructure, is the cause of the sense of nationality. In this case, we've got, so the people who are setting up all the laws are in turn being affected by the laws themselves. So the cause being, the law, my sense of nationality is produced by the laws that I create, the symbols that I construct. In these cases, people are creating all of this from scratch. It's not like these people are born with the flag of the Hutt River Province. They design it. They're not born with the taxation system of the Hutt River Province. They design it. So they are really designing their own sense of subjectivity. And so whereas in a lot of more standard situations, we can maybe see a much more clear cause and effect relationship, here it is a cause and effect feedback loop. Because everything is being made from scratch, and so everything is being imagined anew. And that's really where we get to this is actually very much utopian. This isn't just about utopianism as a way to imagine a new story or a new future. This is actually living it. So our first example is Sealand. All right, so we read about this. What I'm going to do in each of these examples is I want to just sort of fill out a couple of details here and give it a little, and give the micronation a little bit more context, and maybe make it just a little less weird, because you kind of read through these examples and it just seems so bizarre. So I want to give each of these a little bit more context, and so that we can imagine, why would these people do this? What sort of things would motivate me to actually do something this wild and crazy? And I want all of you to keep your mind open here And while each of these examples are these very are enacted by these very quirky and strange people, I think we all have to admit that regardless of their ideology, these people should really be admired for just their self-confidence and their commitment to a vision. So in each of these cases, these people have gone through great risk and great sacrifice to enact these very wild and kooky visions, and they did it. They did it despite a lot of much larger, more of policing forces trying to get in their way. And I think that on some level, regardless of whether you agree with their ideology, I think you have to admire the effort. Okay, so Sealand, as you read, was originally a Navy outpost during World War II off of the coast of England. It becomes abandoned, and in the 60s, a group of countercultural, really a group of countercultural, anti-war, hippies went out there and established it at first as a pirate radio station. Now, that's sort of how it starts, and then its history continues into all sorts of other, I guess we could say, sketchy enterprises. But really, what I want to focus in on this example of Sealand, because it is a good example to start with, because we can really kind of start to see how these micronations do present interesting challenges to international law. Okay, so here is where Sealand exists. It exists to this day. There is the outpost out there in the English Channel. So it was established in like 1965 or 1967. I can't remember off the top of my head. And what was going on out there was a lot of pirate radio, or in other words, they had set up a radio station, and they were broadcasting on whatever frequency band they wanted to broadcast on, and they were doing it without a permit. They were able to do it because, as you can see, they were in international water. So for the first 20 years of the history of Sealand, they were in international water. They were not in British waters. Interestingly, the United Nations in 1987 decides to extend the limit of sovereignty into the water for all nations. So this was not in response to Sealand, but it does emphasize in a way, it emphasizes Benedict Anderson's point. So up until 1987, where you see that dashed black line, Sealand was in international water. Then the governing body decides to reimagine how far all nations' borders extend into the ocean. Suddenly, Sealand is now within the borders of England. Okay, so they were out there. They were doing pirate radio at first, and then started doing other sorts of business. And throughout, the main person out there, I think his name is Alexander Bates, becomes really he becomes interested in how he can establish Sealand as an independent state, as a state independent from England. And this gets us into concepts from international law, or how the United Nations goes about establishing who is a state and who isn't. There are two main theories of statehood from international law: the constitutive theory of statehood and the declaratory theory of statehood. These theories are what lawyers in international courts use to litigate all sorts of disputes between different nation states. It's also what they use to try to declare independence. So if you have a state that used to be a colony that wants to declare independence, it has to deal with constitutive and declaratory theories of statehood. So I'm going to take us through these two, and then I'm going to talk about how this relates to Sealand and how we can use Sealand as a way to think about these two theories and how they both are incomplete and problematic. So the constitutive theory of statehood, which is really the standard in 19th century international law, is the theory that statehood is established once a state is recognized by other states. So in order for Spain to be Spain, there must be agreement among other states that Spain is in fact Spain. So France must say, well, yes, we recognize that Spain is Spain. And Portugal says, yes, we also recognize that Spain is Spain. So in other words, statehood is decided in a sort of almost democratic way by all of the other states. So that's the constitutive theory of statehood. And it was, like I said, the standard in the 19th century. Now, you can understand why there are some limitations to this theory. And you can understand why maybe this theory becomes less powerful, less prominent after the 19th century. So if constitutive theory is the way to decide, and really we're just relying on the other states, then there is no universal condition of statehood. In other words, we can't define it based on some sort of foundational principle. We just have to rely on everyone just agreeing. So this obviously benefits the most powerful states. So the Western nation states can all say, we are states. Our colonies are not. So, and the power to declare what is a state and what isn't resides with the most sort of like hegemonically dominant states. So we can see how this theory, where states must be recognized by other states, the only way to establish statehood is to be recognized by other already established states, presents some problems in the 20th century when the geopolitical order starts to shift. So the declaratory theory of statehood is what emerges in the 20th century. And really it just says a state must only fulfill the minimal requirements of statehood. And the minimal requirements being 4. The first one is it must have a permanent population. So it can't just be, we hang out there during the summer and then go home. Like, people have to be living there the whole time. 2, it has to have a defined physical territory. It has to have a border. 3, it must have a government. And 4, it must have the capacity to enter into relations with others. Okay, so clearly this is an alternative to the constitutive theory. It does not rely on the established powers it does not give all of the pre-established powers all of the rights to definition. But the problem, the limitation with the declaratory theory of statehood is that in some ways it confuses fact with law. What do I mean by this? So a state is not a fact in the sense that the chair that you're sitting in right now is a fact. Because a state, like we were talking about with Benedict Anderson, isn't a physical entity like a chair is. A state is a fact in the sense that a treaty is a fact. So a state really is a legal status that is attached to a certain agreement. So the declaratory theory of statehood really relies on, is very much about like, okay, once we've squatted somewhere for a while, we should be able to become a state just because of the physical reality of it. We don't need to have any agreement with anyone else. Just the possibility to do it. And so the criticism of this is that it's just it doesn't go. That it confuses fact with law. So in order for me to be legally a state, I have to engage with the law. I can't just say, I claim this land for Clint and now it is Clint's. I need to make a legal claim on that. Okay, so what does this all have to do with Sealand? So the people of Sealand want to establish independent statehood, and they are doing this right at the time where there is this sort of, I guess we could say, revolution in international law, and the declaratory theory is gaining prominence. And so they, as interestingly enough, the people of Sealand who are studying international law, not in school, just like reading books about it because they want to establish independence, realize, we can take advantage of this new theory of statehood. So, do we meet the minimum requirements? Do we have a population on this, abandoned platform in the middle of the ocean? Yes. Do we have a defined territory? Yes, it's the platform. Do we have a government? Okay, we've set one up. I'll show you this in a second. They've set one up. Fourth, a capacity to enter into relations with other states. So this is sort of this is one of many examples of both the people of Sealand and the people of Hutt River being really clever with making arguments on the international stage. So what they do is essentially they have some friends or sympathizers who are German nationals. And so they get these Germans to go on to Sealand, and then they claim that they have kept these people as hostages, and they enter into hostage negotiations with the nation state of Germany. Now, this whole thing really was a setup, because all they wanted to do was they wanted legal documentation that they had entered into diplomatic relations with an already established nation state. So really, they just kind of had their friends over there hanging out. They told Germany that these people are hostages. Germany then enters into negotiations to get the quote-unquote hostages back. But now you have a paper trail that says we, in fact, negotiated with Germany, so clearly we are a state. So these sorts of strategies are what they are doing in order to make a legitimate argument on the international stage that Sealand is in fact a state, that it has its own jurisdiction. Okay, so here are some pictures just so we can get a sense of what it's like to be inside of Sealand. So here are some people of Sealand watching the television. Here is here's another angle at this room. What I love about Sealand is the interior design decisions. I mean, you have a wood-burning stove. You have, this coffee table here. Like, the aesthetic is this kind of, this folksy, rural British aesthetic. So they're out in the middle of the ocean, establishing independence from England. And they have these very like old British curtains, these photographs up. I mean, it looks like a little British, like a little British townhouse in there. Okay, so yeah, so this is what it looks like inside. This is them actually establishing permanent residence there. Okay, so what do you need if you're going to establish yourself as a state? You need a flag. So on the left, we've got Sealand's flag that they fly off of their outpost. You need a coat of arms, of course. So Sealand comes up with their coat of arms. I particularly like the fist coming out of the knight's skull. Okay, you also need to set up your own currency. So Sealand's currency is over there on the right. So of course, this is part of them setting up their own economy. They're in charge of their own national bank. You need you need a driver's license. I don't know why you would need a license to drive around on that tiny little platform, but of course, some sort of identification. But yeah, you've got an identity card. You have a passport, of course. So these are like ways that you are as a citizen or as a national of Sealand, you have documentation that says, "Oh, I am of this nationality." Right. So if you went back into England, you would say, "Oh, I am not an English national. I am from the Principality of Sealand." And of course, this is just so funny. They've got license plates. So yeah, I don't know how many cars you can fit on that platform, but they're printing license plates. That's part of like official documentation that individual citizens of Sealand get. You get, of course, you can be nobility. So if you all can do this, you can apply to become a citizen of Sealand, and you can get one of these documents that say, in fact, so you've applied for citizenship and they've granted it. So if any of you are interested in becoming a citizen of Sealand, you can apply online and get a documentation, and you will not then be you have dual citizenship, both American and be Sealandian, or I'm not really sure what they call themselves. But here is the document of the noble title, or citizenship. You can think of it as almost like a birth certificate or a certificate of citizenship. You also need, so these are, we're moving from like the documents that establish your citizenship. Now we're moving into some of the more symbolic aspects of nation building. So especially if you are from the UK, of course, you need a national soccer team. So here is the national soccer team. Of course, they don't play or practice on Sealand, but these are all the members of the national soccer team. Okay, so why did these people do this? I mentioned the pirate radio thing, and I also mentioned the innovative sort of legal maneuvering that they did. But let's fill this out a little bit more, like what really motivated this experiment in particular. So clearly there's an anti-authoritarian thing going on here. They start off as pirate radio, so they want to do radio without having to buy a permit. They want to put things out into the radio waves that are not mainstream. They also have, there's a long history of Sealand being used to do, I don't want to say illegal, but like they're doing all sorts of business deals that are really on that really sort of push the boundaries of legality and oftentimes are illegal. So, and this is just one example, but they, for instance, were hosting hosting data on Sealand, right? And part of the reason that you would host it there is that you would be outside of the jurisdiction of a nation state. And so it's a lot like pirate radio, only they've transferred over into data. So you're able to, all of the data on these servers is now outside of the jurisdiction of international law. So they moved from pirate radio in the 60s into sort of cyber utopian thing of setting up servers there, so that they can put whatever data they want onto it. Clearly, there is a relation to seasteading. So I mentioned this in relation to Buckminster Fuller. You know, he had created a design for a city that would float on the water. And this is, if you guys want to dig into this a little deeper, there are plenty of examples of theories and ideas of like how you could build a utopian world that floats around on the water. So, if any of you are interested in this sort of stuff, just look up seasteading. There is a seasteading institute. So, anyways, but this is people actually seasteading in a way. They are living on a man-built island away from the mainland. Our next example, Hutt River Province. This is the place in Australia that we started with in this lecture with the national anthem. The place that is blessed by God, and for a place where we can live where our dreams can be free. So when you enter Hutt River Province, this is the border, right? So remember, in international law, one of the things you have to do is define your territory. So here, the territory is being defined by this sign. He or they on this sign make border in the larger font. This is intentional. So think about it like this. You're driving along the road in rural Australia, going by these different farms, really, and maybe the next farm down the road is just going to have a address, or maybe it'll say such and such ranch out front. This, not only is it called a province, but front and center, border. So he wants to, they want to really emphasize that this is a territory, an internationally defined territory. Okay, so Hutt River Province exists in Australia. It is, as you can see here, it's on the sort of southwestern coast of Australia. And really out here, it's a lot of land. It's a lot of farmland. So what's the history here? We've got the main person, the king of Hutt River, is named Leonard Casely. So in the 70s, he grew up as a farmer, and in the 70s, Australia established a new sort of like way to tax wheat, and really, I mean, this is about subsidies for wheat. And so what the Australian government did, and this happens in a lot of nation states, is for the general interest of the economy and the people, especially when it comes to food, they said, well, you can only produce so much wheat. So they wanted to sort of control the market. So this guy, Leonard Casely, said, no, I'm going to produce as much wheat as I want. So he starts off by seceding from the Commonwealth of Australia so that he can have the freedom to produce as much wheat as he wanted. But this kind of turns him down a whole new life project where he, like the people of Sealand, starts to become a student of law. And he starts to, as he's reading these old acts that are still on the books, these old laws that are still on the books, he starts to come up with interesting arguments for his autonomy, for the autonomy of the province of Hutt River, or the Hutt River Province, from the nation-state of Australia. So, for example, he found out that still on the books, there was this old law from England that Australia still had from 1495 that said basically a king should be recognized as a king by the way that he dressed. So from there on, Casely dressed like a king every day of his life. The reason he's dressing like a king, so thinking back to the video that I opened the lecture with, he is dressed like a king, right? He's got like the royal regalia on. He's not just doing that because he thinks it looks cool. He's doing that as a legal argument because according to the British Treason Act of 1495, if you dress like a king, you are recognized as a king, you are sovereign. He also used the Geneva Convention. So, and here's the quote from the Geneva Convention: "Sovereignty is automatic to a country undefeated in a state of war. And if the state of war is not recognized by the other party, once the notice is given, then these conventions apply to their relations." So think about that for a second. If you are not defeated in war, you are sovereign. In other words, you have statehood. If the state of war is not recognized by the other party once the notice is given, then the conventions apply to the relations. Now, this is written to protect nation states. So for instance, if I am Spain and you are France, say we go to war, and I win the war, but your response to losing the war is, well, that was never really a war in the first place. Therefore, Spain is not a nation. So they kind of write this as a way for the losers of the war to not be able to rewrite history. But what they don't really realize is, well, what if you're just some guy in Hutt River who figures out a way to declare war on the state of Australia? So Australia will never take that seriously, but you did it. You declared war. So if you do that, then that establishes you as sovereign, even though the state of Australia does not recognize the war. So, of course, Casely declares war on the state of Australia. He sends official documentation to the government of Australia saying, I am declaring war on you. He does not have an army. He doesn't really intend to wage a war. He just wants to declare it. And once he does that, then he can make the argument, well, I am undefeated in a state of war. Now, this all may seem crazy, but he did succeed in this sense. Hutt River exists to this day, and it has not paid taxes to the Australian government since 1970. So all of this stuff, all of this, dressing up as a king every day, declaring war on the state of Australia, this ongoing work allows him to at least make as much wheat as he wants to and to not have to pay taxes. Okay, but of course he's got to do more than just declare war. Like the Principality of Sealand, they produce passports, they have a flag, they have currency. There's Casely, the king and queen of Hutt River Province, walking around dressed like kings and queens to establish their sovereignty. And of course, you also have a national anthem. This is what we listened to during the opening. So John English and the Foster brothers are the musicians who recorded the anthem for the Hutt River Province. So yet another important symbol for the nation. All right, our third example is Chistiania. This is an existing countercultural community in Denmark. Unlike the previous two, this is much more of this is like an anarchist commune existing in Copenhagen. Whereas the first two were really more established by particular individuals, this experiment or this ongoing micronation, alternate state, was much more was established by much more of like a group rather than a couple of individuals. So Christiania in contemporary that exists to this day in Copenhagen. Here are some pictures of it. So what happened with Christiania? Okay, so after World War II, there are all of these old military barracks in Copenhagen that were not being used. And starting in the late 60s, early 70s, a bunch of countercultural people, hippies and artists, started squatting in these old military barracks and started converting them. So it was just ruins, right? And they started squatting there and started transforming them, painting them, turning them into their own community. So again, just to give you a sense, there's like a lot of art kind of stuff going on here. Okay, so in 1971, a group of squatters took over and abandoned military barracks in Copenhagen. And the city of Copenhagen essentially just let them stay there on their own terms as a, quote, autonomous neighborhood. So this is their legal status according to the government of Copenhagen. And they recognize them as a collective. That's sort of their legal status as far as economically speaking. So they were kind of seen as a collective business, also as an autonomous neighborhood. And at first, really, one of the main things that was going on there was it was totally permissive of any type of drug use. That's a typo. It should say 1976, not 1776. And what they find after 5 years of a completely permissive drug policy, they ended up with a lot of problems with people doing really hard drugs and all of the stuff that goes along with that. So they switched to a quote, no hard drugs policy in 1976. I'm not really sure which drugs are permitted and which aren't. But so it still is permissive of marijuana, we can assume, and a lot of other drugs that were illegal in Copenhagen. So one of the main motivations here was being able to do whatever drugs you wanted to. So it exists this way for decades as a autonomous neighborhood. Come 2003, the Danish government changes over from a more liberal one to a conservative one. So we're talking, this is in the wake of 9/11, and there's this trend towards conservative governments in the West. This conservative government takes over, and they pass a bill that turns the individual members of Christiania into individuals. In other words, they are no longer seen as a collective. Now, what that allows the government to do is to not recognize them as a corporation or as having common interest. If they are just a bunch of individuals, that denies them certain protections that they had been afforded up until 2003. And so right after they pass this bill, they send in riot police and they try to break up the community. The community holds together, despite the riot police entering and them facing brutal treatment from militarized police. Come 2007, after obviously 4 years of back and forth negotiation, the members of Christiania reach a new agreement with the city of Copenhagen, where in a lot of ways you can see Christiania as being the losers in this negotiation, but at least they get to they get to preserve the space. So basically, what happens is the city has more control, more jurisdiction over the neighborhood, but by rezoning it for business, it's a way of reestablishing their the people of Christiania. It's a way of reestablishing their status as a collective. So they rezoned Christiania as one large business, and that restored a lot of their protections and their rights that they were, interestingly enough, stripped. Those rights were stripped from them when the city or when the government decided to recognize everyone there as individuals rather than as a collective. So by rezoning it as a business, they are able to sort of reestablish their rights, their collective rights. All right. So in each of these examples, we've looked at real experiments, real alternatives to the state, and we've looked at how they have rebelled against established laws in the present to live out, to actually live an alternate version, to actually live a utopian vision. Whether or not you find these real states compelling, one thing that is undeniable is that these are all utopias that did not fail. Think about that. A lot of time, one of the things, whether it's Rothstein or anyone that we sort of confront with on this, when we are talking about utopias existing in reality, we assume they are doomed to fail. And yet, Hutt River Province still has not had to pay taxes since 1970. Chistiania, despite the brutalization that they experienced at the hands of the Danish military, still exists, found a way to rezone and reestablish their legal status to maintain their collectivity and their collective vision. Sealand continues to thwart established law about the dissemination of media. So in each of these cases, these are utopian visions that are acted out in the world and continue to this day. Next time, we'll be looking at virtual states. So these will be states where there is no physical territory. These will be states that don't even care about the more sort of wishy-washy declaratory theory of statehood, and really kind of push to some more philosophical and conceptual extremes. They are, like I said before, these are some of the most bizarre examples and some of the most bizarre reading that we will do this semester. Stick with it, because I think if you really engage with these virtual states, they can be really inspiring and get you to think about some new ideas for your own final project. Okay, so Friday, virtual states. We're going to dig in there. We're going to probably listen to some music and talk about some really weird stuff. See you then.